Hello, welcome back, welcome back. Have you got your reading companions ready? Ready for another instalment of Jeremy James? The next one is called The Football Match, and we'll find out what happens in this football match. Reading hats on. Every so often, Daddy stopped working. That is to say, every so often, Daddy admitted he'd stopped working. Of course, he wasn't working when he was in bed. In the bath, or in the kitchen, or in the armchair, leaning on the doorpost, or watching television. But otherwise, generally, he was working. His study door was firmly closed, and from the study would come that profound stillness and silence of a man at work. You could sometimes hear a typewriter too, but Daddy always said it was the bits in between the typewriter that were the real work, and the quieter he was, the harder he was working. That's what Daddy said. But every so often, Daddy stopped working, and on Saturday afternoons he almost never worked. And on this particular Saturday afternoon, as on every other Saturday afternoon, he announced after lunch that he was going to take the afternoon off. There was, he had been led to believe, a football match this afternoon, and he felt he needed some fresh air and he might pop along and see it. "Why don't you take Jeremy James?" said Mummy. Daddy thought hard for a minute or two, wondering why he couldn't take Jeremy James. But soon it became clear from his silence that he couldn't find a reason. And so Jeremy James was wrapped up in his thickest sweater and his heaviest coat and his ear-warmingest ear-warmers, and he went off hand in hand with Daddy, blowing clouds of dragon breath all over the winter landscape. They didn't take the car because, said Daddy, it would be quicker to walk. Lots of cars went past them, soon leaving them far behind. But when Jeremy James pointed out that cars were quicker than they were, Daddy simply murmured, "You'll see." So Jeremy James and he went on walking. And when they got near the football stadium, the pavement began to get more and more crowded. And soon they were walking in the road. And Daddy was quite right, because then they started passing the cars, which were hooting angrily. Jeremy James wanted to let go of Daddy's hand so he could be a racing car, zooming in and out of the leg jungle. But Daddy made him hold tight, otherwise, as Daddy said, they'll turn you into a half-time message. Outside the ground itself, there were queues, which were certainly the biggest queues in the world. The queues in Mummy's food shops weren't even queues compared to these queues. There were monster queues, with hundreds of thousands of people, most of them men, which made them even more different from the food shops queues. A lot of men looked very happy. They had bright scarves, mainly blue and white, around their necks, with big flowers, also blue and white, stuck in their coats. One or two men had rattles, also blue and white, which were a lot bigger than Jeremy James's, old baby rattles that he'd grown out of a long time ago. These rattles were so big you could never grow out of them, and they made a much louder noise than 1,000 of Jeremy James's old baby rattles. The queues moved a lot quicker than the food shop queues, and each time someone went into the football ground there was a clickety-click, which turned out to be an iron bar you had to walk through. When Jeremy James pushed through it, it went clickety-click, just as it had done for the man in front of him. But really, when you thought about it, there didn't seem much point, because you could have got into the ground much easier without the iron bar. "I think we'll go in the stand," said Daddy. "It'll be more comfortable." So they joined another queue, which was much smaller than the first queue, and soon they were climbing some steep steps, at the top of which was a man with a moustache and a red face who took Daddy's ticket. And then, for the first time, Jeremy James saw the football pitch. It was quite different to the football pitches on television, because this one was very big and grassy. You certainly couldn't get one of these big grassy ones on the little television screen at home. That was a fact. "Come on, Jeremy James," said Daddy, and pulled him along to a place where people had their feet. When Daddy and Jeremy James arrived, the people took their feet away and Daddy sat down. Jeremy James sat down as well, though he thought it was a bit funny to sit down where people normally put their feet. It was hard too. "We're better off in the stand," said Daddy. "You can see better here too." "Is this the stand, Daddy?" asked Jeremy James. "Yes." "Well, why are we sitting down then?" asked Jeremy James. "Because this is where you sit down," said Daddy. "Then why is it called the stand?" said Jeremy James. "That's an interesting question," said Daddy, "but I haven't come here to give a lesson on semantics." Mummy, of course, would have said, but Daddy often used big long words that didn't exist when he couldn't answer a question. Semantics was one of his favourite words, though Jeremy James knew it was only the name of a tabby cat 3 doors away. Someone was saying something over the loudspeaker. It sounded like, "Warple Shrub, Warple, 4B Gambridge, number 2. And Jeremy James, he was checking that all the footballers had done the necessary before the game started. Grown-ups had a thing about going to the lavatory before you did anything. Then all of a sudden, everybody shouted, and some men came running onto the field kicking a ball. They were dressed in red and white. Most of the shouting wasn't very friendly. But when more men came running onto the field kicking another ball, all dressed in blue and white, even Daddy started shouting a funny kind of "warp warp" shout, as if he knew them. "Are they your friends, Daddy?" asked Jeremy James. "They're the home team," said Daddy. Jeremy James was quite sure he'd never seen any of those men at his home. But Daddy was shouting again, and it was best not to interrupt. A man in black. "Has his grandma died, Daddy?" asked Jeremy James, blew his whistle, almost as well as Jeremy James could blow his whistle. Everybody shouted again, and the men started kicking the ball and running around the field. Jeremy James watched for a little while, and Daddy told him the names of some of the men in blue, though Jeremy James didn't know any of them, and couldn't remember any, even though his daddy had just told him. Daddy said the men were trying to kick the ball into the net at the end of the pitch. But Jeremy James never saw anybody trying to kick the ball into the net at all. Most of the time the ball wasn't anywhere near the net. But the men seemed to be trying to kick it in any other direction but the net. Sometimes the men didn't even kick the ball, but they kicked each other, and then everybody shouted at the man, and the man in black blew his whistle and waved his arms. Once the ball came up into the sitting down stand, very near to Daddy, and Jeremy James reckoned even he could kick the ball closer to the net. Nobody scored a goal, and the man in black at last blew his whistle, and the players walked slowly off the pitch. Daddy started talking to the man next to him, and Jeremy James heard him say, "The ref needs his blooming eyes tested." So Jeremy James turned to the man next to him, who had glasses on and a funny kind of chin, and said, "The ref needs his blooming eyes tested." The man with glasses and a funny chin seemed a little surprised, so Jeremy James added, "That's what my dad says." After some loud music and a lot of talking, the players came out again, and the man in black blew his whistle, and the running and kicking went on much as before. Jeremy James noticed that when a man in blue kicked the ball or a man in red, the crowd was happy, and when a man in red kicked the ball or a man in blue, they lost their tempers and shouted things. But obviously Daddy had made a mistake about the ball going into the net, because no one even seemed to try and kick it in. Until hours and hours had gone by, the man in black was looking at his watch as if he was learning to tell the time, and suddenly one of the men in red kicked the ball very hard, and it went straight into the net. "Oh good," shouted Jeremy James, "he's got it in! He's got it in the net, Daddy!" Then all the people with blue and white scarves and blue and white flowers turned around to look at Jeremy James, because in the silence his voice came out very loud and clear, and Daddy's face went rather red. He told Jeremy James to keep quiet. The man in black blew his whistle for a long time, and the players stopped running altogether, and those in red jumped up and down waving their arms, whilst those in blue walked slowly away watching their own feet. And everybody stood up and shouted "Boo!" as if they wanted to frighten the men on the pitch. And when they'd finished shouting "Boo!", the people started to shuffle out of the sitting down stand, and Daddy and Jeremy James shuffled with them, till they were back in the air again and entering the leg jungle out in the street, passing the cars which were still hooting angrily. In fact, doing everything in reverse from when they'd came. "Did you enjoy it, dear?" asked Mummy when they got home. "Yes, thank you," said Jeremy James. "It was funny." "Who won?" Mummy asked Daddy. Said Daddy. "I must get on with my work." And he went into his study and closed the door firmly behind him, and he was so quiet that he must have been working very hard indeed. Oh, I wonder about that. Does your daddy ever take himself into his study and work very, very hard? You never know. Next chapter is called Chapter 4, Feeding the Elephants, but we'll find out about that one another time. Take care.